Welcome to the Self-Publishing Tips and Tricks Show, a series designed to give you insight into the world of self-publishing and marketing your books. Featuring your hosts, Shannon, the author behind the pen name S.C. Huston, Ben Pick, and Jamie, writing under the pen name J.M. Chaley. Join us several times each month when we interview authors about their self-publishing and marketing journeys, talk to industry leaders, and discuss books about writing, self-publishing, and marketing. Hi everyone, I'm Shannon. I write under the pen name of S.C. Huston, a fantasy romance author, and I have a passion for writing about broken characters who face adversity to become better versions of themselves. And there may or may not be a dragon, but there's always love to find. And today we are doing a book review, and I'm joined by ADESHILE, who has actually been on the podcast before, back in October. And we're going to dive into The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Maass. And I say we're going to dive into it, but we both took a dive and realized we need to go deeper, and we just probably need to do that another time. So we're going to touch on what we've understood from just our first dive into it. But before we talk about what we've learned and how we could possibly apply these lessons to our own author journeys, I do want to introduce our guests and give some quick updates. So first I'll pass it off to ADESHILE. Please introduce yourself.
Hey there. Hi, everybody. My name's ADESHILE. Or at least that's the name I write under. And I write dark fantasy, dark urban fantasy, and a little bit of romance here and there. I don't have a really great tagline or mode of talking about it, but I really like to craft stories where we touch on the human experience and human feelings. So this is actually a really great book that we get to talk about here today.
Great. Yeah. And updates from me. So this is about a month out from when this is going to publish. So I'm hoping I'll be on the tail end of fulfilling my Kickstarter. I have just fulfilled like all the digital stuff, and I got all those links out to the backers this past week, except for my God tier backers. I had 2 God tier backers, and I call it my God tier because it's the highest tier that has like the most money that I would earn from a backer. And so there's 2 things there that I'm still going to be working on, which is the audio commentary chapter by chapter of the book, and also an annotated ebook of the book, which I've started both, but they do take time. And I didn't realize the annotated version takes so much time. So, and I did have a deliverable date by July to them. So I do have a couple months, but I'm hoping to get it done sooner than that. But I just did get my first proof copy of the paperback, and this was the it's just the black and white grayscale. I call it grayscale, but they call it black and white at the printer's office. So it has the images in it, but they're in black and white. And I really love how it came out. So this morning when I got it yesterday, but I didn't know. My husband actually got it, brought it in the house and didn't tell me. So I saw it this morning. And so I looked at it and went ahead and ordered the copies for everybody. So I have 15 backers that got this version. So yeah, I got those copies ordered. Now I had 8 versions of books I had to submit to the printing and distribution company. And boy, it just takes so long for everything. So 3 versions were approved almost right away. That was one of them, but that's the only one I've received. And all 3 of them, I've already ordered a copy. And then I had 5 others that were waiting, and now they've all come back for my approval. And so I need to go through them. But 2 of them have colored edges, which I paid for through a company who said I just need to submit the files as they gave them to me to the publishing company, printing company, which is Ingram. And it would, they would make sure that my edges get printed with that color on there. But when I see the proof copy, there's no color on the edges. So I'm like, well, does that mean they're still going to do the printing with the color on the edges just because the proof copy they gave me doesn't have it? And so I have to look more into it. And being the weekend, the company that did it, they're just a small family company, so they don't work on the weekends. So I have to wait until tomorrow to send them an email and be like, I got my proof copy. It doesn't show the printed edges on there like you gave me. Is that okay? So I need to figure out if that's okay. And then 2 of them that came back, the proof copy shows me where I messed up on the cover specs. So I need to fix those on 2 of them. So making progress. I'm hoping in a month when this comes out that all of them will have been approved, and I've got a copy coming in the mail, or I've just received it, because I think that took like 2 weeks to get in the mail once I put the proof copy in or put in the order for the proof copy. But yeah. So what about you? What's going on with your writing?
Just before I could talk about that, I was going to say that is a beautiful cover. And that is beautiful. And that's a door stopper of a book. I don't know how many pages it is, but it is hefty.
Yeah, it's pretty big. It's like 677 pages altogether.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, some of it's like, front matter and back matter, the page count. Yeah. But, it looks somewhat comparable. I actually shrunk down the letters just a little bit compared to the first book, because when I gave it to the company who did my color edges, it was 677 pages. Well, I went in there and I decided like last minute to like revise this scene, and it made it a little bit longer, but it was 677 pages is what I had formatted. So I had to try and keep in the 677 pages. So I just shrink down the text just a little bit, but really side by side, decide with, well, I mean, that's the first book. I'm showing on screen both books, the first book and the second book of the series. But there is a difference because the first book of the series, the one that I'm showing on screen, actually also has the prequel novella in it. So this is the special
Okay.
edition that I sold only with my Kickstarter, my first Kickstarter. So it looks like it's the same, but it is longer. It's about 50,000 words longer than my first book.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
That is impressive, I will say. That's impressive. That's a lot of heart put into your words there. So that's
Thank
awesome.
you.
In terms of me and my writing process right now, well, so the story I'm working on is a fantasy, dark fantasy romance, right? We
Mhm.
have a combination of that going on, and it's really interesting that we are reading the book that we're reading together now, or we'll be discussing, because I mean, since there's romance in there, it's, there's emotion, but not just that. The main character has a lot that they have been through and are going through, and we're seeing them kind of open up at different places. So looking at how to show and tell that when we have two characters who are very different from each other, it's such an interesting journey. So I'm glad that we've been focusing on this book that we have here. So yeah, my writing's going along. This was supposed to be a short story of maybe 5 to 10,000 words, and
Yeah.
now I'm already at over 30,000. And so if I can keep it to 50,000, that'd be great. But it's probably going to be 70,000 words. So
So you're
well,
not short story.
yeah, my not short story. That's just same. I don't know what it is. Any story I try to write almost always goes like multitudes the length that's
Yeah.
supposed to be. But that's what I'm working on, so it's going pretty well. I even wrote a little novella of it. No novella. I actually did write a short story for it. Because I was diving back into character even more.
Mm.
And then I was like, hey, let's just take this little bit of a backstory and put it right here. So it's very similar to Matchstick Girl, if you've ever read that.
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
Okay, it's a very heartfelt story. So my little short story that came off of a short story
Yeah.
is already written. So yeah, that's how my writing's going.
I'm like you, it's hard to write short. And I don't outline, but I've learned to outline when it comes to shorter works. And my work ends up being longer than the outline, but at least it stays short enough to still qualify as either a short story or novella, whatever it is I'm aiming for. So,
I got you. I
because
got
I
you.
did the same thing. I was supposed to write a short story as part of the first Kickstarter novel I did. And it ended up being my not short story because it was 72,000 words when I finished. So,
My short story is a full length novel. I mean, why not?
yeah. But I remember thinking, I was like, I cannot do this. I cannot spend this much time on something, especially because this is like a companion in a way to the main novel, and it has spoilers for the main novel.
Okay.
So you'd have to read the novel first and then get this book. So I can never sell that book on its own. And I'm like, I can't spend these months writing a book I can't sell.
Right.
So,
Right.
and I do say that as I can't sell it, but I did sell it as part of this Kickstarter. But I made sure I put the warning in there. Don't read this if you have not read A Curse of Scales and Feathers because it has spoilers. And several people added it to their order. So I did make
Oh,
some money from it that way.
nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right, so now let's dive into this book by Donald Maass. And this is The Emotional Craft of Fiction. And I like to start with reading the book's description. While writers might disagree over showing versus telling or plotting versus pantsing, none would argue this. If you want to write strong fiction, you must make your readers feel. The reader's experience must be an emotional journey of its own, one as involving as your character's struggles, discoveries, and triumphs are for you. That's where the emotional craft of fiction comes in. Veteran literary agent and expert fiction instructor Donald Maass shows you how to use story to provoke a visceral and emotional experience in readers. Topics covered include emotional modes of writing, beyond showing versus telling, your story's emotional world, moral stakes, connecting the inner and outer journeys, plot as emotional opportunities, invoking higher emotions, symbols, and emotional language, cascading change, story as an emotional mirror, positive spirit, and I don't know how you say this word, magnanimous.
I know what word you're talking about. I think so. Yeah, I think that's how you say it.
Right.
Magnanimous. Yeah.
Yep,
We'll say yeah.
that word.
That word.
Writing, the hidden current that makes stories move, and readers can simply read a novel or they can experience it. The emotional craft of fiction shows you how to make that happen. And so now I like to look at whether or not we felt like this book fulfilled the promise that we found in the premise of its book description. And I would say it does. I think it touches on all these things that the book description points out. I mean, these are almost word for word taken from different sections of the book. So it does touch on these. And Moss is trying to help us as writers learn how to make a book an experience versus just something they simply read. I think there is the underlying promise that's not stated, right? So it's implicit that if you read this as a writer, you're going to learn how to be able to do this with your writing. And while I think that is possible, I think this book is much deeper than just a read. It needs several reads to really get in and understand it. That is my thought. So what are your thoughts, Adesha?
I agree completely. So, does the work do what I say it's supposed to do? I would say yes, because I can already see places where I can bring more emotion to the craft that I've been writing. I think he does a really good, and I'll talk more about this at length later. But I think he does a really good job at putting different exercises throughout the book
Mhm.
to help you with that. Because as I was reading exercises, I was thinking back to different scenes. I was like, I could expand this scene here. I could do this differently here. So even if it weren't like, even the book is not perfect or whatever, I'm not saying it's good or bad or different, but I think it did achieve its goal overall because I can implement it. I do think that it's not a book you can just read once. I had to kind of rush through and read just because some stuff that was going on. But even still, I think I read the first part of the book like twice. So each section it's worth its time because emotions are kind of squishy, and
Yeah.
so trying to understand how that plays out, he does a really good job, I think, of giving examples of each of the ideas that he talks about. It would have been beneficial for there to been multiple examples of each
Mm.
topic, just because, as he would say, we respond differently emotionally based on the page, based on who we are.
Yes.
So a couple more examples per point would have been very helpful. That said, it would have ballooned the book up
Mm. Mm.
quite to large numbers. But I really do think that he achieved his goal. And if you read a book like by any book by Robert Greene, like 48 Laws of Mastery or 48 Laws of Power, excuse me, The Art of Mastery, and a number of other things. He gives you a lot of background information. He gives you examples, and at the end, he might give you some other text that you can consume. And you can't. Each of those things are so encompassing, like human nature, that you really have to take your time with it. So I think this is one book you at least read it through once, and then go through each section as needed to really utilize it and apply it to your craft.
Yeah. And I think you touched on something there I didn't think about when you said like the examples you would have liked more than one. And I felt like some of the examples didn't work for me. Like didn't understand what he was trying to say and how that section did what he was saying. It didn't make sense. I thought I would have liked it if he would have broke down the example more, but it could be that section, that those examples, some of them, not all of them, but some of them just didn't resonate with me the way he said that some it may resonate with others because we are all different.
Yeah,
So that I think also made it hard to really understand some of his points.
absolutely.
And I think I would have preferred him to break down each section a little bit more versus,
That
having the example there. The example didn't always work for me.
that
So,
I agree. So like and viewers, listeners, for me at least, this isn't say it is a bad book. This is
yeah.
just my like it would have been so much better, so much easier because as SD Huston said, like some of these sections I had to like go back through because it didn't hit the way
Yeah.
that he may have intended. But he does state that like as readers, we don't just read what's in front of us, we respond. I mean, that was a very key point he made. We respond to it, but since we're all different, it's hard. So it would have been nice, multiple examples, and then perhaps like underlining and pulling out sentences to show what emotional impact they may have caused.
Yeah. All right. So he does emphasize the importance of emotional impact in fiction. And I want to talk about some of the techniques, or at least what was one of the techniques you thought that he suggests for creating deep emotional connections with readers that you seem to think that might work for you?
Okay, so there are a lot of them, but one of the main ones that stayed with me was the very. I guess there's two. So all right. Technically the third level, he said, I think it's called like the third level emotion, and is essentially like, yes, you might have an emotion that you want to express. Write that down. Now, what's the other emotion there? Write that down. And what's the other emotion there? Write that down. And then I forget the other steps, but then he talked about several other steps of bringing that emotion to light. I think it's like, give us an analogy that relates to it. Actually, if I can, I'm going to pull up my notes here and see if I can find it very quickly because I found that was a crucial lesson there. Okay, so third level emotions. Objectify by creating analogy. This is after you've written your third emotion. Objectify by creating an analogy. Create a moral judgment the character would have regarding that feeling. Like, is this good? Is this bad? List alternatives that that person might feel, and they'll be thinking this or saying this or what have you. And then end with that character justifying why they feel that particular way. So it's some person's technique, and I forget the name that he used, but like I can use this all the time. This is great because what happens, an example he gave was like I had time to understand what was going on because we have some backstory and analogy that's there. It worked because there is a story, there's a description or an analysis or a discussion of what the character is feeling. And it's never just on the nose. Like we'll get one feeling of the character that they might state, but because of how that feeling is covered from front to back, like the book ends, I would say, I get a sense of the deeper experience that the character is having.
Yeah.
So I really like the third level emotions technique that he brought up in the very beginning of the book, actually.
And I don't think he uses these words, but it reminds me of another book I've read. I wish I could remember. I couldn't remember it then when I was reading this, but about how there are subtle emotions. So, like if you have a scene where it's a husband and wife and they're arguing, but one's like, you didn't take out the trash like you said you were going to, and then and then the other person says, yeah, well, you didn't do this, and so whatever it is that they're arguing about, it's not actually what they're mad about. There's actually an underlying emotion under all of that, and that's what it kind of reminded me of.
I agree. Yeah, I think one of the things he says later on, this goes really in place of like showing versus telling things, but it's like it's about the subtext. It's like
Yeah.
what is underneath there.
Yeah. And he does talk about how this is more than just showing, which I appreciate that point that he had. I really liked this section where he brought in Newton's law with the
Oh
balls
yeah,
that clap.
oh yeah.
When you have the what is that called? I can't remember what that's called. It
Um,
has the balls that touch, the
yeah,
metal balls that touch, and you lift one and it hits the other one, and that force, that inner,
Newton's
force that
cradle
comes from.
or something like that. I forget.
Yeah, so it's a law of motion, right? That so what one person does is going to affect another. And I think in the exercise he talked about one of the things he said is what influence has the main character had or the protagonist had on someone else, which I've always thought of, how do other people in the story influence the main character? What kind of influence do they have? What actions do they do that influences my main character, which causes my main character to act and do and make these decisions that he or she makes? I never thought about like what is the actions that they're making that has on other characters other than because I do write romance. I will write about that between my romance couple, but I've not really thought about it in terms of like the characters around them. So I
Right.
thought that was a really interesting idea.
I like that. That's yeah. So I really resonate with that because in the stories that I write, where in some of my series, right,
Mm-hmm.
what happens amongst one group of like one faction impacts another faction, and then their behaviors impact each other. So when that whole cascading effect, I'm like, yes, because that I think makes the world much richer. And then like we can see the main character change because of whatever characters are doing. But we can also see those side characters be more than just side characters. Like
Yeah.
they have their own lives and their own journey. So, if we need to do a spin-off and write a story about them, in another romance book or another fantasy book, we've already seen the direction that they're headed. So yes, I agree. That was a really good section of the book.
And I think that possibly we do this already. We just didn't really think about it in terms of how do they affect the protagonist. So I always just, and I was like, all my characters do have like their own thing going on, their own story, their own motivations, but it's what they're doing, but not what they're doing that affects the protagonist. That is happening. I just never thought about it like that.
Right.
So yeah, I thought
That makes me think of another chapter that really stood out to me. It was like it was towards I think it was the reader's experience or the writer's experience or journey, but I think this chapter is called Positivity.
Mm.
And I thought it was really interesting. It's like, as writers, we bring our heart and our views and our experiences to what we're writing. And that also, based on the day and how we're feeling that day, right? But it's like when we're crafting these stories, we don't have to approach things from a pathos or like the world is bad, our characters are just struggling. Like we can make those characters be very positive. They can be very active in the world and they can see the positive things going in the world. And he said even in dystopian. So I read a fair number of post-apocalyptic and dystopian books, right? And one that I've been reading recently is called Hell Divers. And it's a long series. And what Moss says is like, what's the safe spaces in this dark world, essentially that people can connect to, that the characters can exist in and find refuge in, and that basically the readers can find refuge in. Like it can't all be dark and gloom. So what's a barbecue in that world? What's a trait that is worth celebrating in that world? And as I started thinking back to him, it's like, despite all the things that happens in Helldivers, long short, sorry, side note of that story is that the world kind of nuked itself. People are living on ships now. They have to dive to the surface to get supplies to keep their ships going, right? But there are a number of cultural things that they do. Like they have a saying, like, we dive so that humanity can survive. Like that's something that keeps coming back.
Yeah.
They have artwork on the hulls of their ship from creatures that they may have never even seen, as just as something that they hold is very precious, because like I guess hope or whatever. But like there are certain elements that they keep that keep things positive despite the dark times that they're living through. So I thought that chapter was really good as well.
I was actually going to bring that up too. Is that, and he put that all in his positive. He said, but it's the one word that you have to keep in mind that people want to read for, and that word is hope. And I think you touched on that. So, and he brought up the idea of it wasn't apocalyptic. It was about to be apocalyptic because there was an asteroid coming for the
Yeah, yeah,
Earth.
yeah.
They had 6 months left to live, and this one detective comes across a scene that was dubbed a suicide, and he thinks it's a murder, and everyone's like, well, why does it matter? Because they didn't say it, but basically the world's going to end in 6 months, so why does it matter that we even care if it was a suicide or a murder or whatever? But this guy is still doing it, and I think this is like a good scene to kind of what he was talking, to exemplify what he was saying, where you can talk about emotions without talking about emotions, without naming the emotion. It's never said that this detective has hope or anything like that, but the fact that he doesn't give up gives us hope as the reader, and I really appreciate that. But that kind of goes back to something, and I've said this a few times, like when I've been like on my writing on my writing sprints on my YouTube channel, where if you find something boring and you're writing it and it's boring, your readers are going to think it's boring. And he
Yeah.
touches on this. He's like, your emotions, the way you feel about your writing, is going to come through your writing. So
Yeah, no, what was it? I've heard too before, like, because a friend was talking about him writing. It's like, man, I cried during some of my rhymes. Like, no tears in the author eyes, no tears in the reader's eyes. Like you feel, you bring out the experience when you're writing. So it should move you to some extent.
yeah. But I do like that he touched on that one word of hope, because he talked about how a lot of times our characters are in bad situations. Well, I write about characters who face adversity.
Yeah.
They're broken characters who face adversity, and I'm like, yeah, all my characters come from like broken backgrounds, like something's happened to them, some type of trauma, or something's happened to them. And I was like, do I do what he's saying? Do I leave this idea that there's hope in there, and they're gonna, and I think I do, but now it's really making me think about what
Right.
I'm doing.
Right. I
So
as well. So my friends say that my writing is very very gritty, very dark. I never said I say on here that I write dark urban fantasy or in
mhm.
dark fantasy, but that's not the term I came up with. My friends and those that have read it's like, oh no, your stuff is dark and gritty. I'm like, is there hope in there? Yes. But now, like seeing this, I am very conscious. Like I forget all the things that the author says in there, but there are a number of things that the characters can do that shows that despite the dark path, the dark situation they might be in, like they're still positive about life. I think he said like find something that happens that the character can notice, and maybe it's something that only they notice, that they can smile about, that they appreciate. Show how they are taking action, even though the situation is bad. I think when we talk about the example you gave about the detective, I mean, part of that is that he can still do his job. Yes, the world is literally going to end,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that he can't do his job. That's something still within his control. And one can find hope in that. Like,
Yeah.
despite all the stuff that is going on, there are still things that we can do to keep hope. And in his situation, too, kind of the moral stakes, some things are still worth fighting for. I remember that was one of the lines from the book. Some things are worth fighting for. So, I think I've heard about people being stuck in isolation as well, and like the need to keep routine as being so key. But what is that? It's managing your physical world, but managing your internal world. So that's something we can give our characters as well. How are they taking control in situations where things might seem hopeless, even if
Yeah,
it's a small way?
because it gives them hope to keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really did appreciate that part. So we have a few questions that I developed for today's broadcast. But even looking at the questions, I'm like, what the heck? How would I answer these things? I mean, I wrote down some notes, but I don't know. I really do feel like I need to go back through and read this book again and again in order to understand some of it. And I wanted to ask about, when he talks about using psychological underpinnings of our characters to enhance the emotional depth of our story, because I like anything psychology. My bachelor's degree is in psychology. But at reading through that section over a couple times, I mean, I came up with the answer. And basically, it's, I think about like my current work in progress. My main character is fiercely independent, but I hadn't really thought about what fear drives that trait.
Mm.
So I think that I think using his approach, I can realize that she's terrified of being emotionally indebted to anyone, and that can add more dimension to her actions. But I still feel like I'm not quite understanding his whole concept, and I do need to go back through and read it again. Do you have any thoughts about that one?
I also was like, oh, I don't know how to answer this. So what I did was I combined the parts of the book that stood out to me to try to answer that. So for me, what stood out was binding the reader's experience with the characters, and part of that is he talks about the characters that he might not be able to relate to. Typically, he's talking about like a Katniss Everdeen, for example, from the
Oh,
Hunger Games, and some other characters as well. He's like, they have heart, they care, they make me care. And so that brought me back to another part of the book where he was talking about or heart values. That's the term he used, heart values. So let me see if I can pull it up very quickly here, because there's a whole slew of heart values that he mentions. So he lists a number of heart values, and I'm sure there are more. So compassion, insight, commitment to justice, family, love, steadfastness, sacrifice, selfishness. These are all heart values. And I think those, I mean, I don't know if we can consider them psychological elements or not, but like I can relate to someone who has a commitment to justice. I can relate to someone who cares about family, who cares about love. Going again to Katniss Everdeen, he talks about how do you bring emotion and love into like a dystopian. Well, Katniss wakes up, which he says like that's the one thing you don't do. Don't have a character waking up, right?
I know, right?
Katniss wakes up and reaches out, and she's reaching out for her sister. And then she reflects on how her sister is probably in her mom's bed because today is the reaping, And so in that, we're shown that, to me, psychologically, this is a person who cares about someone besides themselves. I now care about this person. And he talks about that. So that's how I at least kind of took that question. It's like, well, these are traits that these people find important, that we find important. So I will bond to that character and be more curious about their flaws, their struggles, everything else, because like they're a person I know, like they're a person I can relate to one way or the other.
Yeah, it's building that empathy so that your reader will at least like the character in some way.
Yeah. Michael Anderle, 20 books to 50K. He's written a whole bunch of books that you guys haven't seen. But one thing he said about his main character in that series was that justice was going to be crucially important for her. She's going to be super cool, right? Because I'm trying to use clean words here, but super cool. But justice is the main focus, and a kind of an unjust situation happens to her, right? So, well, we care about justice. I want to know what's going on with this cool character, and we follow her story, right? So he already somehow knew, like, yep, putting this in this character, let's go. And I think his series has done very, 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 very well.
All right. So I'm not going to go on to some of these other ones. I wrote answers, but I just don't think they're very in depth. So I was going to go on to something else.
I got. If you ever feel like you want to do part 2 of this, when we both have read through it again, like second with it, I'd be more than inclined to do so.
Well, there was another section in the book that was called The Seasons of the Self that I marked, and I really thought this was interesting. It kind of goes more in depth from some lessons I learned from another book. And I
Hmm.
think that one was gosh, I could see her face. Kim something or other. But anyway, so the idea is, right, you have a protagonist in most stories who has a goal, a want and or a need, and they could be the same or could be different. But they have an overall story goal. And in like a 3-act structure, there's usually like three times that they're stopped from getting their goal until the climax, and then they get their goal or they don't get their goal. In most cases, we like stories where they get their goal, but there are stories at work that they don't get their goal.
Right.
The Electric State, that
Hmm.
one I still can't get over. So spoilers, her goal is to find her brother and save him, and in the end she can't save him, so she didn't get her goal. And I remember I cried so much. I was like, but that is a story structure that is valid. They
Right.
work toward their goal and they either get it or they don't get it. Most times they get it. But the things that lead up to them, losing at these different points where these things come to light that stop them from getting their goal usually has to do with like their own character flaws, which come from things that happen to them in their life. And so when Moss talks about seasons of the self, what he has you do, the exercise he has you do at the end of that session is to look at the periods date of your protagonist's life and think about what events began and ended each one. And I kind of already do this. I look at the big things that have happened to my protagonist's life and I write these down as kind of like a mini outline for the
Hmm.
character before I start writing, because I want to know what event shaped them to be who they are now. And I try to write down up to 3. Sometimes I don't always get 3, and it's supposed to be increasing. So like the first event might be they lost their dog and that really shaped them. But then the second event is they lost their sibling. Okay, now it's still more loss, but it's deeper and more impactful. And then maybe the last thing that happens is that they lost their home. And
Hmm.
so each one is supposed to be more and more and more. And I'm not always able to figure that part out. That was the exercise in this other book that I had read. I can't remember. But I think this is kind of along those same lines, except they don't actually have to be like as impactful. But he is talking about writing down these errors in your character's life and even give them names is what he's talking about. And, trying to figure out what events unfolded in their life to lead up to this point. And I think that's really interesting.
I agree. There's another author. I don't know how to say her name. I'll define it and I'll share it with you. But one of the things that he said in crafting a character is go to, I think, like when they're a teen, like 16, because usually somewhere 16, 15, somewhere around that time, because usually there's an event or something that happens that kind of changes the rest of the direction of who they are.
Yeah.
So I agree. I mean, there are going to be main points that happen through our lives that, seasons that changes how that character's going to behave. So yeah, I'm in agreement.
Yeah, I really like that section. Was there a section that really called to you other than, I know you talked about the third level of mastery?
So for me, this section on emotional plot of
Mhm.
fiction, both as an idea, but also in the context that they have. So for those who haven't got a chance to read a book yet, he starts off even talking about the hook. So he talks about how, as authors, once you start reading about, publishing, etc., or just writing your work, period, you're like, oh, I gotta create a hook. I need to create interest, intrigue. People might put my book down at sentence 1, so I need to make sure I grab their attention. In the first couple of sentences, the first page, right? It ends up being a pretty big deal for a lot of people. But what he mentions there is that there's also an emotional hook as well. So not just the intrigue. Intrigue is important, but on the other side of that is the emotion, the idea of an emotional hook. So going back to Katniss Everdeen again, one of the things that we ask ourselves very quickly, he says, is what is this reaping? Like, this does not sound good. Like reaping, and we're relating it to people, that doesn't sound good. What is this? So that is the hook, right? That's the hook we can think about, intrigue. But before that, we know that there's some concern about what's going to happen with Katniss's sister, and that is the emotional hook. So we've already kind of bonded with the character, but we also care about what's going to happen with these other characters, and that's within the first paragraph. And so there is that as an example. But when you look at your writing overall as having an emotional plot as well, he talks about the importance of plot, but those are a sequence of events. And so, like, when we look at thriller, like, yes, he mentions, like, we got to keep things moving fast. What's the next thing in intrigue? What's the next thing of intrigue? If we're looking at romance, it says, well, really, there's just kind of one plot, but, we get all the feels. But overall, we're looking at the plot of emotions. And I think, so one of the authors that I appreciate, Dean Wesley Smith, he talks about intuitive writing or writing to the dark a lot. You jump into a character's head and you just just start writing everything based on how they experience and feel about things, their opinions, so on and so forth. But what that gives you is the same idea, an emotional plot. Like it makes being an intuitive writer make even more sense because we are feeling what the character is feeling. Like that is the where we're coming from, period. And that's why it can work. Now, yes, we may need to work on the technical plot elements, like making sure all the outside actions match up. But as a reader, as the author says, as a reader, I care about the emotional impact. I want to care about this story. Like there are so many, there's so many TV shows I can watch versus sitting down to read. So make me care.
Yeah.
And I think just that idea that yes, we have our plot, and then perhaps parallel in its own wavy, curvy way, we have our emotional plot. I think that's great. Great section of the book.
I agree with you. I felt like, not just from this section, but from different parts of the book, I felt like he was a little bit of a snob, a literary snob. Now I write romance, and he mentions, romance typically is an emotional plot because you're talking about a love story between the two, but also fantasy. Fantasy is known for having kind of what he says in the book somewhere. Fantasy's plot. It's all plot. It's what's going to happen next. So, and he talks about how trying to get the emotion in there more. And I just kept thinking, I was like, I feel like I went to go and look to see what year this was published. I feel like this was published like a long time ago, but then he mentioned something else that I was like, no, it couldn't have been that long ago. 2016.
16.
Yeah, because a lot of the best-selling books now are like genre fiction, but they have a lot of emotion in them. And so I think he was talking about how you can take the genre fiction like thriller and make it more emotional, the emotional arc. But sometimes just the way he worded things, I felt like literary snob. And I think that kind of comes from my experience because when I attended my master's program for writing, I didn't know that there was such a divide between literary fiction and genre fiction.
Right.
I didn't know this existed until the very first person said something about like, well, anyone who writes genre fiction writes it for money. And I thought, well, I've been writing genre fiction since I was 9 years old. I didn't even think about money back then.
Right.
So
Right.
it's what I like to write.
Yeah.
And then that's when I started learning that there's like this, there's a little bit of a snobbery in there. But that was back in 2013. So I was like, I'm hoping things are changing a bit. I guess, I don't know. I find literary fiction to be mostly boring. Not all of it, but it's
all of it, not all of it.
Yeah.
So and then so for me, I think about what things are technically literary fiction, but then become genre fiction because it can be just written extremely well and then become a classic and considered literary fiction, but it's really genre fiction. So I don't know. I agree. Some literary fiction pieces are great, but hard reads as well.
The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And actually, a lot of Margaret Atwood, what she's written, is genre fiction, but it's considered literary.
Right.
So, like The Handmaid's Tale.
Right. So I don't know about Hyland. I don't know if his work, because I think he wrote Starship Troopers. And I don't know if that is considered genre fiction or literary fiction at this point in time.
I don't know.
It's like Jane Austen. I think her work would someone consider her work
literary
fiction, but would it also be considered genre fiction at this point? I don't know.
Because it's historical fiction.
Yeah.
So sometimes I felt like, and he is a literary agent.
Okay, but he did give a critique of both and their need to write emotions well. I forget it's very beginning, but he does not exclude literary fiction from it. He did make a critique of both of them. So I don't know.
I think it was just his word choices every now and then.
Oh, really? I get you. Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. I didn't take it as a literary critique, but I guess I took it as in these genres, this is what they tend to do.
Yeah.
But maybe that's snobbish. I might have just not read it in there, but I think I understand what you're saying because he definitely was like, as thriller, we're just like about the macabre, or not the macabre, excuse me.
Well, he was like, you're not just about writing action and getting to the next action scene. I think it's like kind of what he said. He's like, you're not about just this. You're not just that. And I'm like, but those books are known for being action scenes, and they're known for having magic, or they're known whatever the genre is. But I do understand what he's saying because the books that draw me the most have that emotional arc in them.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we have one final question before we wrap up. So based off of everything we've read, what is one exercise or technique suggested by Maass that you found the most helpful or intriguing, or what's the best thing that we could tell readers to take away, the best tip or trick that they can learn from this technique?
Oh, I don't have this one memorized, but once again, the section on positivity, just because
Mm,
I can use more positivity in my way of existing in this world, and I think the world needs more positivity.
agree,
Period. So
agree.
that's my immediate one. Like I forget all the things that he detailed in there, but I think he was right too. Like there are so many characters that we can come from it from a pathos state where if these books are lessons essentially in themselves of how we can engage with the world, whether the world is cheery and happy or whether we're going through a dark time, if we can show how a person can reclaim power and be positive and happy, even during hardship, what a good gift to give people, and what a
Yeah,
gift to give ourselves as well. Because we got to
yeah,
write it, you know, like
right.
we had to spend there putting, punching out the letters. So
Yeah,
I think whatever all the details were with that, I think that would be a top one for me. And then second, I know you only asked for one, but second will be that third level analysis of the emotion.
yeah.
And then on concept or principle, I know I'm really jumping off the question wagon here, but the I think what stayed with me was the idea of it's like magic. Like it's indirect subtlety that makes things work. You build things up around the emotions that you want to show, be it by actions or states of being or the words that they say, but you build it up and you layer it so that when people get to it, they come to the surprise themselves. Like, I feel all of these things here. You never said this, but I feel this. And maybe that's odd for people to hear, just, they're just watching this, but I guess the best example, or one of the examples that come to mind, is Hemingway.
Mm,
I'll actually take a second here to read that section. So the example he's using is from Hemingway's short story called "Now I Lay Me," and I'll read the passage to you. And this may not be the most emotionally drawing passage, but I still felt something from this character's state of being. So I'll read it now. That night we lay on the floor in the room, and I listened to the silkworms eating. The silkworms fed in racks of mulberry leaves, and all night you could hear them eating and dropping sound in the leaves. I myself did not want to sleep because I had been living for a long time with the knowledge that if I ever shut my eyes in the dark and let myself go, my soul would go out of my body. I had been that way for a long time, ever since I had been blown up at night and felt it go out of me and go off and then come back. I had never tried to think about it, but it had started to go since in the nights, just at the moment of going off to sleep. I could only stop it by very great effort. So while I am now fairly sure that it would not really have gone out, yet then that summer I was unwilling to make the experiment. So for me, that passage right there, when I listen to it, like it's not about the silkworms,
mhm.
like the author says, and it's like, oh, that's an interesting story about silkworms. But this guy, not only can he not go to sleep, his rest is forever disturbed by an experience that happened to him years ago. And as the author says, like shell shock, PTSD, like that passage made me as a reader stop and pay attention. It's like you can't sleep, like, and not like, oh, you're just saying you can't sleep, but like, no, there's something deeply wrong. You have experienced a hardship and you struggle now, and you live with this perhaps forever. And that, as simple and as plain as the language was, that spoke to me. And so there are other examples that use that touch me a lot more, but like I can understand, like, because of I don't have PTSD, but because of my experiences, I can see how something like that could stay with a person. So that was very, very impactful for me. So yeah.
Yeah. So my one section that I really want to try, he starts it off, and this is, we were talking about this, the third level of emotions. You just brought that up. You brought that up earlier. And the way he starts off the exercise in that section is kind of things that I've heard before, which is, you just pick up a spot in your story where your character's feeling something, and you just keep digging down, like, okay, what are they feeling now? Well, what's underneath that emotion? What's underneath that emotion? And so you keep digging down into it. But I think the part about this that really was interesting to me was that when you're writing this, is it should be a longer passage in your story. So it shouldn't be something that's just touched on and then moved on. You want to have reason, to create this longer than like 15 seconds. And that way the reader can process all these different levels of emotions versus them, being told what the emotion is. They can arrive at their own emotional response, which is what that passage you just read, that passage did that. So yeah, I agree. I really loved that part.
Yeah, I think that might have been one of my favorite parts of the book
Yes.
period. Because it was the passage that they actually used in the book for that was I had to listen to a couple times, but I had already had the feelings of it. I had to listen to the passage several times to break it down based on the third level emotions that they were talking about, like the systems that they said about find those.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, ADESHILE, for joining me today. I really appreciate the time you took to read the book and share your insights with me, even though for both of us, I think we really need to read this thing again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So, I don't know if we want to do another podcast episode on that, but I think it definitely, if anyone's thinking about reading this book, if you've not read it, I think that we both suggest give yourself the time and space to read it. Don't, if you've got an ADHD brain like mine, or you got lots of stuff going on, this is not the book to read really quick. So you really do need time to delve into it. All right. So links for ADESHILE will be in the show notes for the podcast and the description box for YouTube. We've got another book review episode, which is releasing on June 15th, where we'll discuss Networking for Authors by Dale L. Roberts. And that will do it. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much to our incredible listeners and viewers for joining us on our exploration of everything self-publishing. We hope you found our podcast to be a treasure trove of insights and inspiration. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform or thanks on our YouTube episodes. Don't forget, you can catch all of our past episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and other major podcast platforms. Keep writing, keep publishing, and we'll see you next time.